A heavy summer heat lay over the pine woods outside Columbia, South Carolina, in June 1982. At an abandoned drag racing strip, Newby Franklin Love paced with restless energy, waiting for a small plane to emerge from the dusk sky. Love, a burly country-born kingpin with big ambitions, had arranged for a pilot to fly in over 1,200 pounds of Colombian marijuana under cover of night. He had the landing site picked out, cash in hand, and a crew at the ready. But fate and poor planning intervened. Miscommunication and low fuel forced the smuggler's plane to divert, eventually being abandoned at a rural airfield outside Columbia. The next day, law enforcement found the plane, its seats stripped out to make room for cargo, long-range fuel tanks nearly dry, and 18 bales, 541 pounds of marijuana still on board. There was a close call for Love, but he wasn't about to give up. He had bigger dreams and, as he saw it, nothing to lose. In the early 1980s, Newbie Love was determined to turn the sleepy South Carolina backwoods into his personal pipeline of drugs and money, no matter the risks. Newbie Love's rise in the underworld started in small-time fashion, selling cocaine and marijuana around South Carolina in 1980 to 81 with a few associates. But by 1982, Love's operation exploded into something the state had never seen: a homegrown Dixie drug cartel with international reach. He partnered with a savvy smuggler named Sue Robinson Youngblood, who became his most trusted lieutenant and lover, some whispered. Youngblood had connections in Florida and supplied Love with a steady stream of high-grade cocaine, which she ferried north to him in South Carolina. Love distributed the coke to dealers across the region, reaping huge profits that he poured back into even bolder ventures. He didn't hesitate to use violence to protect his enterprise, even hiring henchmen to rob rival drug dealers at gunpoint, making sure to target criminals unlikely to report the crimes. Love would loan his crew shotguns, pistols, stolen cars, whatever they needed, and in return took a cut of the jewelry, cash, or contraband they stole. With his strategy, not only did he eliminate competition, but he also funded his own expansion through these robberies. "We hit the hustlers that ain't with us," he told his triggermen in so many words. By mid-1982, he was ready to cut out the middlemen and deal directly with sources in South America, a risky gamble that would prove his undoing. Love's grand plan was to establish an air smuggling route from Colombia to South America. Across the summer and fall of 1982, he organized a series of increasingly daring drug flights. The first few attempts failed spectacularly: the June fiasco in Colombia, another plane that crashed in the Colombian jungle before pickup, and yet another that landed short on fuel in Sarasota, Florida, where police seized 46 bales of marijuana from the abandoned aircraft. He bought or stole new aircraft, recruited pilots, sometimes unwitting DEA informants as fate would have it, and kept upping the ante. By November 1982, Love set in motion his most audacious scheme yet: a two-part shipment that would bring in 4,500 pounds of marijuana on a cargo plane, followed days later by nearly a half-ton of cocaine. He even boasted to one recruited pilot that his organization had already made 6 successful drug flights before, and that 3 of his planes had been lost on runs to South America. This was a man who treated airplanes like disposable getaway cars. To ensure success, Love dispatched one of his allies, Robert R. Rosette, along with a Colombian contact, to accompany the hired pilot. It was a doomed mission from the start. The pilot, secretly working for the DEA, sabotaged the flight by faking engine trouble and setting the plane down early, a delay that caused the Colombian partners to overload the plane with marijuana, which then exploded on takeoff in Colombia. Once again, millions of dollars in drugs went up in smoke. Newbie Love was frustrated, but not defeated. As Christmas 1982 approached, he prepared one last try, what would turn out to be the final chapter of his criminal career. Through informants and wiretaps, federal agents learned that Love's crew was arranging a massive cocaine run: 700 to 800 pounds of pure coke destined for South Carolina around December 20th, 1982. This time, authorities lay in wait. They tracked the smuggler's newly acquired plane, complete with a secret beacon installed by the DEA, as it took off from Columbia and homed in on the drop location, the small Sumter County Airport in the rural Midlands. On the night of December 19th, 1982, Love had a reception crew of his own ready in Sumter. He and his enforcer, Rusty Corvette, assembled a group of 10 men armed with machine guns and hand grenades, vowing to fight the police if the need arose. It was a scene out of a war movie. Mercenaries crouched by an airfield hangar, crickets chirping in the dark, the smell of diesel and adrenaline in the air. Love was preparing for a literal battle to secure his prize. Shortly before 10 p.m., the inbound plane signaled its approach. Instead of a remote farm strip as Love had often used, the pilot boldly radioed the Sumter Airport tower for landing clearance. At 9:47 p.m., the twin-engine plane touched down on the runway. Moments later, law enforcement units who had quietly surrounded the airport made their move. A Customs Black Hawk helicopter thundered overhead, flooding the tarmac with light. Love's lookout scattered. In the chaos, the pilot and a Colombian trafficker bolted, but agents swarmed the plane and the grounds. Hiding under a shrub near the terminal, officers found one Colombian courier, reeking of kerosene and cocaine, with $4,000 cash and a Medellin plane ticket in his pocket. Inside the aircraft, agents unzipped duffel bag after duffel bag to find 955 pounds of cocaine. Bricks of pure white powder worth an estimated $350 million on the street. At the far end of the runway, police pulled over a pickup truck trying to flee. The driver was Love's pilot associate, Robert Lee, exhausted and reeking of the same chemicals from unloading cocaine. Newbie Love and Sue Youngblood had been waiting at a nearby farm to receive the shipment. But when they drove up to investigate the commotion, officers were already securing the area. Love tried to play it cool. Agents gave him a chance to explain what he was doing, lurking in the early morning hours near an obvious drug drop. But Love offered no answers. Instead, he tried one last desperate ploy. He asked to step aside to relieve himself. Under the watch of agents, Love wandered into the shadows by a tree and hastily shredded incriminating papers in his pockets, scattering the pieces among the pine needles. Youngblood did the same in the bushes. They almost got away with it, but a sharp-eyed agent later retrieved the bits of paper, which revealed names and phone numbers of co-conspirators, a who's who of Love's drug empire. The game was over. In the aftermath, prosecutors threw the book at Newby Franklin Love. In 1983, he was convicted on 17 federal counts, including racketeering, RICO, interstate travel, in aid of racketeering, smuggling, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The notorious Kingpin statute that targets drug kingpins. Judge and jury made an example of him. Convicted South Carolina crime boss Newby Franklin Love received a 70-year prison sentence, the newspapers reported, for masterminding an international cocaine and marijuana smuggling ring. Love went down hard, with no possibility of parole on the Kingpin charge. As he was led away in handcuffs, he finally looked defeated, a Southern outlaw who flew too close to the sun. The courtroom evidence read like something out of Miami Vice. Stolen airplanes, coded messages, gunmen with grenades, and millions in drug money. Even President Ronald Reagan took note from afar. Reagan hailed the broader campaign that nabbed Love and others, saying, "Operation Jackpot was our first major breakthrough in our war on drugs." For South Carolina, Newbie Love's downfall was the end of an era. The biggest drug lord the state had ever seen was locked away. Yet in the taverns of Sumter and Columbia, old-timers still talk about Newbie's war, how a country boy from Red Bluff built a drug empire that reached from the coke labs of Medellin to quiet Carolina cornfields, and how it all came tumbling down one frantic winter night.
It's a photo that's been shared nearly 10,000 times. Two Girl Scouts thanking this man who stopped at a buy-low in Malden and bought all of their Girl Scout cookies so the girls wouldn't have to stand in the rain.
Late this afternoon, 7 News learned disturbing new details about the mystery man in that picture.
The upstate night sat heavy like a wet coat. The pines huddled close while Greenwood dropped its voice about a man who could move weight like a storm front. They called him Fat, and when Detric "Fat" McGawan slid onto a block, plans shifted, and the street learned his gravity. By the mid-2010s, paramedics were seeing too many bodies go gray and still. Blue tablets, 30-milligram look-alike stamped V on one side, 4812 on the other, were showing up at overdose scenes. Tiny circles of sky that could drop a grown man to his knees. Investigators in Greenwood County started connecting the dots. Phones lit up, stash spots got warm, and the name McGowan kept circling back like a hawk. The map pointed to a crew working the corridor between Lawrence and Greenwood counties, with product and cash spreading further out into the Carolinas. You can trace one thread of his world to a quiet spot in Mountville, a stash location worked off Jefferson Davis Road, where dope was stored and cooked down. It wasn't just one hustle. It was a system. Heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, mixed, pressed, parceled, and pushed. And the money moved like water. In October 2018, according to the feds, 4 members of the outfit plotted to ship over $1 million out of the country, southbound, to bring the pipeline back north loaded again. Names stacked up around McGowan: Donald T.J. Thomas Jr., Christopher Cunningham, Richard Longshore, Trevor Hull, and more, each a gear in the engine. Crews like this don't need the big city to be big. They just need highways, quiet roads, and folks willing to do a job without asking who it kills. Then came the winter plot twist that made him national. A photo outside a buy low in Malden. 2 Girl Scouts shivering in the cold, a man stepping up, peeling off $540, and buying all 129 boxes so they could go home. "Pack up all your cookies," he told them. The picture went viral. The comments called him a hero. Days later, DEA and marshals rolled up with an indictment that had been cooking for months. One thing I can say, the Girl Scout cookie story had nothing to do with this guy being picked up, a DEA spokesman said. They were coming either way. The timing just made the fall louder. Court papers filled in what the street already understood. The government said as early as 2016, the crew was pumping more than $1 million in heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl through the upstate, and in the sweep they seized 20+ kilograms of heroin and close to $1 million cash. That's not nickel and dime, that's wholesale. McGowan's role wasn't just hands-on, it was orchestration. Phones, couriers, stash houses, and the kind of discipline that keeps a conspiracy humming until the door finally kicks. When the cuffs clicked, Fat didn't fold. He strategized. Jailhouse concrete has a way of shrinking a man's options. The FBI says he tried to cut a darker deal, offering a cellmate $10,000 to take out his prosecutor and a witness. When confronted by the feds, he confessed. In the underworld, violence is a kind of punctuation. In federal court, it's a new chapter with worse pages. He pled out in August 2019. Drug conspiracy. Heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, tramadol. Possession of 1+ kilo of heroin with intent, money laundering conspiracy, and 2 obstruction counts tied to the murder-for-hire talk. The judge weighed the poison and the plan, then in March 2020 laid down the time. 420 months, 35 years, followed by a decade of watchful freedom. No parole in the federal system. That's a long clock, even for a man who learned to keep his face stone still. On a Lowcountry night, Barrett T. Boulware's shrimp boat glided through dark waters, stuffed with kilos of dope. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter patrolling the waters of St. Helena Sound came across 2 shrimp boats lurking in the inlet, far from any safe harbor. What the Coast Guard found that night hinted at a hidden empire. One of those boats, the Waterworld, was owned by Lowcountry shrimper Barrett T. Boulware. Locals had long suspected that the man with the flamboyant personality boats hauled more than just fish in their nets. In the humid backwaters of Beaufort and Jasper County, Barrett T. Boulware's name carried the intrigue of a folk outlaw, the gentleman smuggler who eluded the law's grasp for years. The legend of Boulware took shape during the era of Operation Jackpot, President Reagan's early 1980s blitz on drug smuggling in South Carolina's Lowcountry. By 1983, federal agents, led by a young U.S. attorney named Henry McMaster, had cracked down on a ring of so-called gentlemen smugglers who ferried bales of Colombian marijuana through the maze of tidal creeks and hidden inlets along the coast. Barrett Boulware and his father Barrett Sr. were prime targets. In February 1983, a Coast Guard cutter boarded Boulware's 65-foot shrimper, the Jeanine Ann, as it sailed from the Bahamas toward Beaufort. Stacked high in the hold were 854 bales of marijuana, nearly 17 tons of cargo, tightly wrapped and far more lucrative than any shrimp catch. It was a colossal bust, the kind that made headlines and sent a chill through the Lowcountry smuggling community. Authorities believed they had finally cornered the Boulwares when the father and son were arrested and charged in connection with the haul. But in a twist of fate, their case unraveled just as it was coming to court. The government's star witness, a boat captain named Franklin C. Branch, who had agreed to testify about the Boulwares operation, met a sudden and violent end. One April night in 1983, Branch was struck and killed by a vehicle under mysterious circumstances, just days before he was due on the stand. Investigators noted that Branch was scheduled to testify in a drug trial at the time of his death. With their key witness gone, prosecutors had little choice but to drop the charges. In the end, neither Barrett T. Boulware nor his father ever faced prison for the dope-filled shrimp boat. Boulware's near miss with the law only burnished his legend. In the neon-lit bars and dockside hangouts of Beaufort, one could imagine Barrett drinking a bourbon with a wry grin, swapping tales with other sea captains about one-step-ahead escapes and fortunes made on forbidden cargo. He had become the embodiment of the smuggler folk hero, living proof that in the wild south of the Carolina coast, old family names and local influence could still outfox federal lawmen. In fact, the Boulwares were no common criminals. They were entwined with the Lowcountry establishment. Barrett's father had been friends with Randolph Buster Murdaugh Jr., the powerful local prosecutor, for decades. That connection would only deepen in the new millennium, as Boulware developed close ties with Buster Murdaugh's grandson, none other than Alex Murdaugh, the now infamous attorney at the center of a Southern crime saga.